Thank you, Sandy and CCH, for inviting me to do this particular session. I have usually nothing better to do but to just give talks. Number one is a number of you know me, so that is very comforting, that if I don't say anything much, at least we'll have tea or coffee afterwards. But what I'm going to say is fundamentally taken from a number of presentations that I've made over the past few years and rehashed to see how I could sort of fit it into this tax landscape. And some of you are obviously practitioners who have been in the tax profession longer than I have. And some of you are fairly new, so bear with me if it's some basics that come forth. I just wanted to quickly, I always think that it's good to have a starting point before I go into details. I'm going to just talk about in the limited time that I have. Limited because this can take 3 hours. I've only got about 40 minutes, yeah. I'm going to cover about tax system just very quickly. Won't spend too much time on this, but I suppose most of you are interested in the third bullet point, the trends and outlook. My views, of course. And then I'm going to look at tax practitioners, some trends and opportunities, and that will probably give an opportunity for the next speaker to perhaps add on to that. Now, fundamentals all of us know, I hope, and it's good to always remind ourselves that when you look at a tax system, we can always curse and swear at an existing tax system. We can always look at a tax system in another country and say, well, how wonderful it is. But I think in the end of the day, the Malaysian tax system is actually a very good system. It's got things to little mending to do here and there, but fundamentally it's far much better than many others. It's not perfect. In fact, there's no system which is perfect. These are some of the ingredients that one has to look at when you are trying to determine or establish what's a good tax system. These are what the economists come up with, the 6 principles. Unfortunately, some of these principles conflict with each other. It's not perfect. You cannot achieve all this, but you need to bear that in mind when you look at designing a tax system and how do you go forward. So I won't explain this because I think you can read it in various other books and so on. But the most important thing is the last one. Not for us, but for the government, for the country. They need to ensure that they collect enough revenue. All right? Fiscal adequacy is very important in any tax policy that one comes out with. All right? Now, then I just want to touch on very quickly tax administration, because those of us who are tax practitioners deal with the Inland Revenue Board, deal with customs, and therefore obviously have first-hand view of the administrators. What are their objectives? Obviously, we all know they're there to interpret the law. Not necessarily interpret it in accordance with your interpretation, but it's an interpretation nevertheless. They are there to enforce the law. So they impose penalties, and we get very upset when we hear when penalties are imposed on our clients. And we all fundamentally know that the law provides for it, but we still get upset, right? Recent developments have indicated this. So I'm just putting that point across, that whatever we see in terms of the recent developments where penalties have gone up, as imposed by the Revenue Board, it's all within the power of the law. They all have the right to do that. And there's really nothing we can do about it. All right? Other than rave and rant and hope that they will allow us an appeal process, which they are allowing. But I guarantee you that it's unlikely that you'll get a waiver. So you need to bear in mind that these are within the law. We get used to certain practices. And so when certain practices change, we get upset. But that's human nature, right? So just what you need to do as a practitioner is to forewarn your clients. Remind them of the law and not of the practice at all times. Because many clients go away looking at the practice. What is normally done in practice? So in practice, the penalty is 200 ringgit. And then when they get hit with a 20% penalty on the tax liability, they might well sue you for giving them wrong information. So you need to protect yourself. Okay. Obviously, administrators are supposed to also suggest modifications to the law based on their own experience and so on. So that's happening here in terms of amendments to the law. Now, I don't need to remind you of all this, but tax compliance is all about reporting, paying, planning, of course, in accordance with legal provisions. And tax compliance is also about trying to avoid penalties where possible. Right? Sometimes it's impossible because your clients insist on filing late. Yeah? So that's fine. But more importantly, it's also managing risks that our clients face or you face. Okay? Now, a few words about tax professionals. Tax professionals are there to assist in interpretation of the law. Again, we all know that interpretation can differ, but so long as we have the basis, we should stand by it. And sometimes it's painful when you're trying to stand by your interpretation and fighting within the revenue. But if it's the quantum involved is high enough, you should be prepared to fight. And I think it's encouraging to see that a number of cases are now going to the court process. It's encouraging because that's the only way we'll develop our system in terms of interpretation of law. But it's painful because it means more cost to taxpayers who are wanting to fight the system through the court process. But I think the only one who gains from all this generally are the lawyers, which is fine. We tend to help each other out. Suggest ways of mitigating tax liability. That's what our role is, to try to see how we can manage the liability in the context of what is available in the law, incentives, whatever. But as professionals, we have a practice and we need to manage our risks. Same thing for corporate. Corporations also need to manage risk, and I'll talk about that a bit later as well. Professional conduct obviously is crucial. We all are members of various professional bodies. We have rules to follow, regulations to follow. And it's an area that we need to pay more attention to, because I think not many pay attention to the fact that are they doing something in accordance with what their professional bodies require them to do. We are an intermediary. I'm talking about practitioners. Sometimes in the revenue will tell you that our role is to educate and inform our clients, and I think that's quite true to some extent. Right? We have to inform our clients about developments, we have to educate them, but we cannot force them to do something. Right? Obviously, as practitioners, like any other business, timeliness in delivering our service is now very, very crucial. It's always been crucial, but this time and age is now becoming even more important. And if you find that the clients are not happy with the delivery and they have many other service providers they can choose from, that's kind of a trend that is happening now, that will move on to someone else. So that's a challenge. Proper advice and assistance means proper in terms of you've actually covered the law, you've actually interpreted the law in accordance with various canons of interpretation, various case law decisions, and not simply give an opinion which is not very well substantiated. It's very important because sometimes the advice and assistance you give is fundamentally in writing, and sometimes the dangers are language is important in how you convey something to a client, how it can be interpreted by a client on reading that particular advice. It's very crucial. Now, around the world in a number of countries, US, Australia, and a number of other developed countries, tax practitioners get a little bit of a bad name because a number of them are seen as promoters of various avoidance schemes, what we call mass marketed schemes. So there have been many such issues, for example, in Australia as well. So Malaysia, we don't really have that fundamental issue. We're not being, as practitioners, we are not being labeled as promoters of avoidance schemes. When we say avoidance schemes, you mean that you are really mass marketing in the sense of selling that scheme to various clients. But I can tell you that the Inland Revenue Board is having one eye on this. And what sort of created or caused this particular concern among in the Inland Revenue Board was that thing about the imputation system, which is being phased out and replaced by a single tier system. How clients can utilize the existing imputation credits. We call it the Section 108 credits. And we call that a monetization of your credits. The Inner Revenue Board has suddenly, over the last couple of years, woken up and realized that a number of so-called planning assistance is being provided. And the only reason they really are concerned about it is because they see a number of refunds going up because of dividend flows, interest being expenses being deducted against dividends, and then claiming back your 108. Nothing extraordinary, but it depends on the substance of your transaction. So they have actually used these words to me as well when I met them, various occasions when I meet them, about these schemes. And the point to make is, if the law allows it, what's the problem? That's my response. But at the end of the day, to us, it's about substance, defending your particular advice. So we don't have a big issue, but those are some of the things that we have to be very clear about. As practitioners, risk management strategies, we all have to exercise reasonable care. I think many of us don't really read Section 1141A deeply enough. That is one section that we will see in the near future some practitioners being pulled up and taken to court. That is something Inner Revenue is waiting to test and to make an example of a practitioner who they feel has crossed the line. It's very important to be aware of that and the public ruling which explains it a bit further. So I'm just alerting you that the environment that we are in, the authorities that we deal with, friendly as they are always on the lookout to make some examples, because that's one way to get the message across that they mean business, right? Of course, ethical standards and so on. Let's go on to tax reform. And I, again, won't repeat all this because these are taken from the OECD in terms of what's a fair tax system, what's an efficient and competitive tax system, and a simpler tax system. We all know this is what we all want, we all need. Everyone needs this, but there's only a certain limit to where we can go. And in some ways, some of our changes are in line with worldwide development, some are not yet, so I won't go into that too much. Then when you look at administration reform as well, tax administration, the tax administrators are also changing. And if you've seen how our very own Inner Revenue Board is slowly changing in terms of the various divisions, the departments they have created. The most noticeable one was the multinational tax department that they have created for transfer pricing and so on. It's because of what they see happening and what they see happening in other countries as well. So many of them have this issue about a lot of tax shelters coming up. People are looking at schemes and trying to minimize tax, but which they feel is not in accordance with the law. All right? So we always have this issue of what's tax avoidance. There's always two views to this. And they feel that there's too much of that going on, and so they're looking at response. This is not Malaysia. This is internationally, things are happening. Move towards more integrated administration. Administration by segment or function rather than by the type of tax is now changing. For example, a number of authorities have large taxpayers unit, a number of them has mid-sized units and so on, something we never had before. We will eventually see this in Malaysia as well. We're moving towards more cumulative withholding taxes as well as more information reporting. Example of this information reporting was the recent issuance by the Inner Revenue Board of a form that multinationals need to fill. And we're not sure whether anyone has taken legal advice, but are we required to fill that? Actually, it's not a prescribed form, but it is still an information that the authorities can ask. They do have the power to ask you for information. And you are usually powerless to say, I don't wish to give you information. So there's a lot more of information gathering now, and there's improved risk management in the Inner Revenue Board. This particular form that we're talking about that MNCs need to fill up in terms of their related party transactions it's very clearly stated that the issue there is to assist the Inner Revenue Board so that they can carry out their risk management and assessment of the taxpayers and actually decide on whether they should audit you or not. You know, it's a very funny thing. Because I would expect that they would have that information they can gather in other ways. But they're asking us, please give us the information so that we can do our work better. Actually, nothing wrong with that as well. But it gives us a lot more work. And so compliance costs go up. They have better access to information. The use of new technologies is now on the move in terms of the authorities. And of course, we all know good compliance requires good taxpayer service and so on. This is on the side of the administrators. Okay, and also what is happening around the world is a lot of the administrators are pushing this idea that tax compliance should also be placed very clearly in the terms of the corporate governance agenda of an organization. This is one of the many segments of, we all know about corporate governance, I think, right? But tax is still a small part of it, but it's not been pushed hard enough. It has been pushed in countries like Australia, where the authorities have actually written some years ago to all the boards of PLCs, the commissioner of the Australian Tax Office, reminding them that taxation is an important part and the board of directors must be involved in. Not everything day to day, but at least the broad, what is the impact of some of the major changes or strategies that you adopt. Okay. Now, Malaysia itself, coming back to where we are, we all know that we have certain issues. Tax revenue is obviously a concern to the government in terms of the fact that we have deficit budgets. So it's a burden. We all know there's a need to widen the revenue base. And we all know that it's a very competitive environment in the world. And countries are actually racing towards trying to lower their tax rates or in order to attract investment. But there's a little bit of a hold up in this in the last couple of years. Because of the financial crisis, many countries have actually started increasing tax rates. Right? Marginally, but many countries are doing that in the Euro area. But fundamentally, we are looking at developing countries. We are all competing and everyone is going down lower and lower. Right? So Malaysia has the same issue. How do we attract investors? And we all know that taxation is just one of the factors, not the only factor. We have a dependence on petroleum resources. We all know that's very risky for the country long term. So that's why there's a need to look for some new changes. And so the fiscal constraints has led the government to look at new sources of tax revenue. We all know there's over-reliance on petroleum, but we also know that there needs to be an efficient system, and then we come to this need for broad-based tax, and you all know that means a GST. And I think moves are on the way to actually do that. Actually, GST is something that will happen, it's just that, the question is, will it happen after elections and so on? And the answer will probably be that if the government of the day wins the elections, then GST will come. Obviously, if they don't win the elections, then we don't know. But I can also guarantee you, it may not happen very fast, that even the opposition, if they come to power, will introduce a GST in due course. There's no two ways about this. It's just how best to do it without creating an uproar. And I guess it's always about public relations. It's actually about marketing, how the government has marketed this. And I think they didn't market this well enough. They did not spread the word effectively, and people have started forming views and opinions, and suddenly those who shout the loudest are obviously heard. And the silent majority are always silent. And so that's the issue.